This tale is one I've harbored for an extended period. It unfolded when I was approximately 25 or 26, well before I met my wife and prior to having children. I was a fundamentally different individual back then, not in a negative sense, but rather in the way I possessed an abundance of free time and a tolerance for risk that I genuinely no longer recognize in myself. I used to embark on solo backpacking expeditions several times annually, typically within the Appalachian region. I would drive to a remote trailhead, venture deep into the backcountry, far from the established path, and spend a few days completely disconnected. No cellular service, no other people, absolute solitude. I cherished it. My friends considered me deranged, and honestly, to some extent, I was. This specific excursion took place in the Cherokee National Forest, and it irrevocably altered my perspective on backpacking. I had been out there for 2 days, and everything had progressed flawlessly. Music. The weather had been splendid, the trail was serene, and I hadn't encountered another soul since the first morning. However, that tranquility soon dissipated. On the afternoon of the second day, music. I observed ominous storm clouds gathering to the west. I wasn't overly concerned initially. I had trekked through countless rains, and it was never a significant issue. But within approximately an hour, I realized this wouldn't be a fleeting shower. The wind intensified aggressively, and the temperature plummeted so rapidly that I actually paused to add another layer of clothing. By the time the rain commenced, I was already searching for a suitable spot to take cover. The challenge was that I was in a rather exposed section of the trail. As I had anticipated, it wasn't a light drizzle. Music. It escalated from blustery conditions to a full-fledged downpour in minutes. The wind was forcefully bending smaller trees sideways, and I could hear branches cracking and falling in the canopy above me. I began to feel genuinely apprehensive about my safety. Lightning was striking quite close by, and I was hiking at an elevated altitude with a metal-framed pack on my back, far from ideal. I pressed on, thoroughly drenched by that point. I was scanning the woods on either side of the trail for anything that could serve as shelter. As if by some miracle, I genuinely spotted a structure through the trees to my left. It was small, dark, and partially obscured by the foliage, but it was undeniably man-made. As I drew nearer, I realized it was a tiny single-story cabin. It appeared exceedingly old, as if it could have been a hunting cabin or a homesteader's dwelling from decades past. There was a solitary window on the side I was approaching. I cannot overstate the relief I felt. I practically sprinted towards the structure and pushed the door open. Inside, it was dim but dry. There wasn't much within, just a chair, a small table, and what appeared to be a cot frame pushed against the far wall. A stone fireplace, clogged with old ash and debris, was situated on the right side. The place honestly smelled quite foul, but I cared about nothing else other than shedding my soaked clothes and lying down. There was no couch or anything of the sort inside, so I literally just selected a spot on the floor and reclined. I was in survival mode at that point, not exploration mode. My sole concern was being out of the storm. It wasn't until I had been inside for perhaps 10 or 15 minutes that I actually began to examine my surroundings. With the storm raging outside, there wasn't much else to do besides switch on a flashlight and investigate. So, that's precisely what I did. There was more within that cabin than I had initially perceived. For starters, a sleeping bag was rolled up in the corner near the cot frame. It didn't appear ancient like the rest of the dwelling, which puzzled me. There were also a couple of cans and water jugs on the table, leading me to believe someone had been using the place as a sort of base camp. Perhaps another backpacker or a hunter. It wasn't unusual to discover such items in remote cabins, but the more I looked around, the more things began to trouble me. There were marks on the wall near the door. Initially, I thought they were merely damage from age or weather, but when I approached to inspect them more closely, I could discern that they were scratches. There were dozens of them, some shallow and some deeper. There was no discernible pattern or order to the marks, at least none that I could perceive. I stepped back and examined the door itself. The handle was a simple latch, which wasn't uncommon. Despite the storm, I opened the door just to observe the mechanism. There was a metal bracket on the exterior of the frame, which appeared designed to accommodate a padlock. The bracket was on the outside. There was no corresponding latch on the inside. That meant the door could only be secured from the exterior. Things only grew more peculiar. I shut the door and resumed surveying the cabin. The only item I hadn't yet inspected was the window, so I walked over to it. The glass was still perfectly intact, which surprised me given the apparent age of the place. But then I noticed why. Screws were drilled into the window frame, one in each corner, securing it shut. Those two had been driven in from outside. And around the edges of the frame on the inside, there were more scratches, deep ones. These were unmistakable. They honestly looked as if someone had attempted to pry the window open with their bare hands. All of it struck me at once. Someone had been confined in this cabin, trapped, meaning held against their will. I should have departed immediately, and I did contemplate it, but a significant part of me felt that whatever had transpired in that cabin was well in the past. Everything in the cabin appeared genuinely old. Even the sleeping bag, which admittedly looked newer, was stiff and dusty. Furthermore, the last thing I desired was to venture back out into that storm again. So I remained. I'm uncertain how much time elapsed. Perhaps an hour, perhaps more. The storm showed no signs of abating whatsoever. If anything, it had intensified. The rain on the roof was so deafening that it was difficult to hear much else. That's likely why it took me so long to notice the other sound. I detected scratching or scraping noises from outside, somewhere along the left wall of the cabin. Initially, I thought it was a branch, but I couldn't recall if there had been branches low enough to even touch the exterior of the cabin. As I pondered this, I heard two heavy thumps on the porch. They honestly didn't sound like storm-related noises. This time I stood up. I performed that action where you freeze in place and attempt to concentrate by staring at a random spot on the wall. I was trying to listen, but if someone was moving out there, it would have been impossible to hear over the storm. I began to grow paranoid that those sounds I heard were just a few of many, and that the rest had been drowned out by the rain. My eyes drifted towards the window. I couldn't bring myself to look through it. If someone truly was out there, they'd probably be looking through it. I maintained that position for what felt like an eternity. After a while, I began to relax somewhat, thinking I had merely been hearing the storm, or at the very worst, an animal nosing around the cabin. I was almost ready to dismiss everything when I heard something that pushed me over the edge. Pressure on the door, as if someone was leaning their full weight against it from the other side. The wood groaned, and the latch rattled once before the pressure eased. My heart rate instantly surged again, and that's when something clicked. Why would someone be outside in a storm like this, circling the cabin, tapping on the walls, without simply coming in? The door wasn't locked. Nothing was preventing them. And then I recalled what I had discovered inside the cabin, and it occurred to me that perhaps whoever was out there didn't want to come inside. Perhaps they wanted me to remain inside. Perhaps the entire purpose was to keep me confined there. I don't know if that was the correct conclusion, or if my mind was simply spiraling, but I decided I was leaving right then. I didn't care about the storm. I began transferring items into my backpack as swiftly as I could. I had this sickening premonition that something truly terrible was about to occur, and I was right. The subsequent moments were a blur. I was perhaps 30 seconds from exiting the door when I heard the sound of glass shattering behind me. I whirled around just in time to witness something enter through the window. and that was all I could see before the entire room erupted in flames. The flames spread so rapidly that I couldn't even process what was happening. 1 second, I was standing in a dark room, and the next second, the walls were ablaze. The heat struck me like a physical barrier, and the door wouldn't budge. It was jammed from the outside. I slammed into it with all my might, and it yielded. It collapsed off its hinges, and I with it. I scrambled to regain my footing and simply ran. I couldn't even see. I was just running wildly through the woods and rain, attempting to put as much distance as possible between myself and that cabin. But before I could reach a safe distance, I felt something tackle me from behind, and I was back on the ground. A person was on top of me, and suddenly I was fighting for my life. I clawed and kicked and screamed, but this individual wouldn't release me. He was yelling too, and he kept trying to secure a chokehold. He was gouging at my eyes and pulling my hair, and I began to feel dizzy, but I managed to push him off. I got back up and continued running, and whoever had just tried to kill me was screaming like a maniac. I looked back twice. I couldn't see my attacker, but I did see the cabin, which was fully engulfed in flames. I think the image of that fireball is seared into my brain forever. The second time I looked back, the glow was smaller, but still visible through the woods. But I just kept running. For all I knew, I was being chased. I didn't stop until my legs gave out. I discovered a spot where a couple of large trees had fallen across each other, creating a narrow gap underneath that offered considerable protection from the rain. I crawled into this makeshift shelter and simply collapsed. My body felt completely numb, whether from the fire, the rain, or the attack, I couldn't say. Perhaps it was a combination of all three, but I was utterly devoid of sensation. All I could do was remain in that crouched position, struggling to maintain my breathing. I lost all track of time under those trees. Hours could have passed for all I knew. Eventually, I began to regain some feeling in my limbs, and I told myself it was now or never. Whoever was out there was likely searching for me and couldn't be far. So I pushed myself up and began moving through the woods. I had no idea where the trail was, but at that point, I didn't care. Honestly, I can't explain how I survived that night, yet I did. I stumbled upon a random trail and just followed it. I was drenched, probably bleeding from multiple areas, but I kept pushing forward. Eventually, the rain lessened enough for me to orient myself. I found my way to a random trailhead, by which time the storm had passed. I don't recall much after that, only that the first person I encountered drove me to a hospital. I had second-degree burns on my left forearm and the back of my neck. Doctors informed me I was fortunate not to have inhaled more smoke than I did. None of the injuries were permanent, but the pain lingered for a long time. By the time I was fully recovered and safely back home, I vowed never to camp or hike alone again. Someone had deliberately set that cabin on fire to kill me. It's the only explanation that makes sense. It was pouring rain, a full-blown thunderstorm, and the roof was metal. There's no way a wooden structure ignites that quickly unless the wood had been pre-treated with something. I gave the police all the information I could, but I could tell they weren't going to pursue it seriously. To be fair, I was in an uncharted part of the woods, so it would have been unreasonable to press them. The only thing I still don't understand is the timing of everything. My wife would probably say I stopped taking solo trips because I matured and became more responsible, and she's not entirely wrong. However, I never told her about this incident, and I know I'll never go back to trekking alone. My name is James. This occurred about 7 or 8 years ago when I was in my early 20s, still engaging in activities I probably shouldn't have been. I had a friend named Charles, notorious in our group for discovering exciting places to explore, like abandoned buildings and old factories. If a place was off limits, Charles had likely already been there and could tell you precisely how to get in. He spent an unusual amount of time on Google Earth and niche urbex forums, constantly flooding our group chat with screenshots of random locations he wanted to investigate. Most of us would entertain his ideas, but never actually follow through. I was usually the exception. Charles and I had been friends since high school, and I believe our compatibility stemmed from having similar risk tolerances. While most of our friends would hear his proposals and exclaim, "That sounds insane," I'd hear them and ask, underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, one, underscore, underscore. This dynamic led to some fantastic memories and a few situations that, looking back, I genuinely wonder how we emerged unscathed. This story recounts one such incident. One weekend, Charles messaged me about a fire lookout tower he'd located deep within a forest not far from us. I genuinely wish I could recall the forest's name, but I can't. Charles claimed it had been decommissioned years ago and was merely standing untouched in the middle of nowhere. He didn't disclose how he'd found it, but I didn't press him. He was convinced we could hike to it, climb it, and spend the night there. I was more skeptical. Structures like that are usually fenced off, or at least protected. Nevertheless, I promised him I'd at least come and check it out. To be honest, the prospect of being 70 feet up in the middle of a forest with a 360-degree view sounded incredible to me. We chose a random weekend and made it happen. Charles meticulously planned everything, from the drive to what to pack and how to locate the tower once we were in the woods. It was a 3-hour drive away, and Charles assured me the hike, though off-trail, would be fairly short, about 4 miles or so. We set out early on Friday morning and arrived in the woods sometime in the afternoon. For some reason, I half expected us to get lost, or, at the very least, fail to find the tower. That's precisely why I was all the more stunned when we actually did. Catching sight of it through the trees for the first time was an incredible spectacle. I remember blurting out, "No way," when I saw its immense height. I was even more amazed when we reached its base and realized it was completely unprotected. No fences, no barriers. It just stood there in the middle of the woods, seemingly waiting for us to discover it. The cab at the top was a small, square room with windows on all 4 sides. A metal staircase zigzagged up the frame, with a section of vertical ladder for the final ascent to the cab. The entire structure looked as if it hadn't been touched in decades. Some of the lower railings were bent or missing, and graffiti adorned the support beams near the base. Candidly, it didn't look like the kind of structure anyone would be eager to climb, but Charles was practically ecstatic. While I hesitated, debating whether I should try to dissuade him, he had already begun climbing. I yelled at him to be careful, which prompted him to slow down. I thought, "What the hell?" and told myself to stop complaining. We ascended cautiously, testing each stair as we went. Most felt sturdy enough, but a few spots had rusted bolts, causing the steps to wobble. The vertical ladder section near the top was the most precarious part. 20-odd feet of straight climbing, enclosed only by a narrow metal cage. The adrenaline rush was intense, but Charles thrived on it. He reached the top without any trouble. The view from the cab was breathtaking. You could see for miles in every direction. We had also timed our arrival perfectly. The sun was about an hour from setting. Our plan was to camp out for the night and witness the sunrise. There was a reasonably wide wraparound walkway up there, where we initially decided to relax. We opened a few beers and simply enjoyed the view and conversation. The sun eventually dipped below the horizon, and the sky transitioned from orange to purple to deep blue within minutes. Once darkness fell, the forest below us became an undifferentiated black mass in every direction. There wasn't a single light in sight. The stars were incredible, easily the most spectacular I'd ever seen. However, being alone out there in the dark was unnerving me a bit. It was unsettling not being able to see anything, despite knowing there was a vast forest beneath us. Charles noticed my growing anxiety and began to tease me, grabbing my shoulder and the like. But what truly infuriated me was when he slammed his metal water bottle against the side of the tower. It produced an incredibly loud, echoing clang that likely resonated for miles. The sound was so deafening and ominous that I actually got angry with him. I told him I wanted to go inside the cab, and he finally took the hint. There wasn't much inside, by the way. It had clearly been emptied ages ago. He said he would finish his beer before joining me, and I was fine with that. I chose a random corner and began setting up my sleeping gear. But before I could finish, he told me in a very quiet, serious tone to come back outside. This was very un-Charles-like. So, I did. I walked back to where he was sitting and saw that he was pointing diagonally downwards toward the forest below us. At first, I thought he was just messing with me again, but it only took a few seconds to realize what he was pointing at. There was a light down there. It was faint and quite distant, but it was definitely there, and it was genuinely horrifying. It was weaving through the forest at what appeared to be a walking pace, and my first thought was that it was a person who had heard the clang from the tower. I don't know why I felt the urge to whisper, but I did. I told him he was foolish for making that noise, and we were probably moments away from getting caught or arrested or something. He looked at me with a confused expression before saying, "You think that's a person?" Now it was my turn to be confused. What on earth was he talking about? I asked him what else it could be, and he said that the light was moving way too evenly. He wasn't entirely wrong. The light wasn't swinging or wobbling the way you'd expect someone carrying a lantern or flashlight to. But then again, it was probably too far away to tell. I didn't say anything after that. Neither did Charles. He just kept staring at this mysterious light as it continued to weave through the forest. Part of me thought it was just some random hiker who had nothing to do with us, but I knew that was wishful thinking. After a few minutes, it was clear that the light was getting closer. It was also much more apparent that the light was moving perfectly, as if it were floating or hovering. Charles asked me what we should do, and I had no answer for him. There wasn't really anything we could do. Like, what were we going to do? Climb down. As we were tossing out more theories, the light suddenly zipped forward as if it had skipped a beat. It was truly bizarre. For a split second, that light went from steady, even movement to an abrupt forward dart. Then, the steady rhythm of our movement resumed. I felt a clammy sweat break out on my palm, and Charles's unease was palpable. I tried to reassure myself that whoever was below us was merely meandering through the woods without direction. Yet, my hopeful thoughts were clearly unfounded. They were unmistakably heading towards the tower. After about 10 minutes, they reached it. At this point, the light was directly beneath us, and I braced myself for someone to shout up, identifying themselves as law enforcement. Instead, the light simply ceased its motion, remaining fixed in that precise spot below us. From our elevated position, we could only discern the light itself, not the individual holding it. Charles and I fixated on it for a considerable period. The suspense was excruciating for me, but it must have been even more so for Charles, as he once again did something that made me want to hurl him from the tower. The man actually bellowed, "Hey, are you good?" down at the light, revealing our presence. I stared at him in utter disbelief, genuinely questioning how he could commit such a foolish act. We received no response, and the light remained motionless. We waited a bit longer, then Charles yelled again, but still nothing. So there we were, 70 feet up in an abandoned fire tower in the middle of nowhere, with someone or something obstructing our only exit. We were completely trapped. We must have observed that light for a solid 30 minutes, occasionally exchanging hushed whispers. It never budged. I was no longer concerned with stealth. Charles had long since sabotaged that possibility. So, I did what I should have done much earlier. I grabbed my flashlight and directed its beam straight down at the tower's base. Even then, I couldn't discern the source of the light. Eventually, we conceded that there was nothing we could do and attempted to resume our previous activity. We recommenced talking, but I made sure never to avert my gaze from that light for more than a few seconds. Charles theorized it was some type of LED intentionally placed there to prank us, but who would go to such trouble? At one point, Charles declared he was going to descend and investigate, to which I retorted that he was insane. Not only was that inviting trouble, but it was also utterly idiotic and perilous. As we argued, I glanced down and realized the light was no longer visible. There was only darkness, and even more profound darkness, once again below us. I desperately scanned the void beneath us, searching for the light, but it was gone. Charles appeared relieved, but I felt the opposite. He repeatedly told me to relax, suggesting that whoever had been there had likely departed, but I was more terrified than when the light had merely sat there motionlessly. The prospect that someone could be down there, now entirely unseen, was utterly horrifying to me. Charles reassured me that we would undoubtedly hear anyone attempting to ascend the ladder, which I supposed was true, but I remained deeply unsettled. Suddenly, I no longer desired to be in the open air. I proposed we spend the rest of the night inside the main enclosure, and he agreed. So, we entered and arranged our sleeping bags. Neither of us intended to sleep, however. That would have been suicidal. Staying awake proved to be the correct decision, because less than 20 minutes after going inside, we began hearing noises. The initial sounds were metallic clangs that reverberated through the tower's steel framework. They were not footsteps, and I wished to be unequivocally clear about this, because I was specifically listening for footsteps. This was decidedly not that. It sounded more like someone striking one of the support beams with a wrench or a crowbar. A few minutes later, another sound emerged. This one was more of a grinding noise, like metal being twisted against metal, and it persisted for a good few seconds before ceasing. Charles and I kept exchanging glances, as if expecting the other to act, but there was nothing we could do. The sounds continued, seemingly originating from various locations, which truly unnerved me because it implied that whatever was causing them was moving down there. The sounds persisted intermittently for a while. I continuously attempted to mentally map out the sounds, trying to discern their origin, the number of sources, and whether they were approaching or maintaining the same distance. I couldn't make sense of any of it. Charles and I whispered to each other about our plan if we started hearing someone climbing up. I was seated against the cab's far wall, facing the windows on the opposite side. Charles was on the opposing side, looking over my shoulder. There were so many windows in there that we felt unsafe and wanted to be able to see out of all of them. There wasn't much to see, though. They were all pretty dark, with the only illumination coming from the stars and the moon. But then I saw something. A dark silhouette moved across the glass. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing fast enough, but then it passed in front of the next pane over, and that's when it hit me. I couldn't help but yell, and Charles scrambled away from the window. We both immediately darted to the door and pressed our backs against it. If someone attempted to enter through that door, they would have to push through both of us. I kept searching for the figure through the windows, but I couldn't see anything. That was impossible, though. Unless they were crawling on all fours, I should have been able to see them. Charles and I remained in that position for a very long time, and I could hear his hyperventilating. What followed were the most tense and terrifying few hours of my life. Charles and I stayed in that exact position, as if our lives depended on it. By the time the sun began to rise, I was utterly exhausted. When it was finally light enough to see, I counted to 3 and then violently swung the door open, expecting someone to be crouching behind it. But no one was there. Charles and I rushed around its side to confirm, and it was clear. I looked down at the tower's base, and there was nothing there either. We grabbed our belongings and began descending as quickly as we could. We made it about 3/4 of the way down the staircase before Charles stopped in front of me. He just stood on the landing, staring down at the next section of stairs. I looked past him and immediately saw it. An entire section of the staircase was missing. It wasn't just a few steps. I'm talking about a whole segment of stairs completely gone. It was impossible, but we were staring at it. Someone had dismantled an entire section of staircase during the night while we were sitting directly above them. That must have been what those sounds were. But that didn't make sense. The noises didn't stop until after I had seen the person up there. So, had they really crossed that gap twice in the dark? No way. Plus, there's absolutely no chance someone could have done that without us hearing it. That would have been a lot louder than a few clangs here and there. We stood on that landing for a while, trying to figure out what to do. We had to just jump across. It wasn't that far, but it was still scary. Charles ended up twisting his ankle, but I was fine. We made it the rest of the way down, and that was that. There was no one waiting for us at the bottom. There was actually nothing there at all, including the metal steps that had been removed, at least as far as we could tell. Granted, we didn't look around too much. It didn't make any sense, but we weren't sticking around. I still don't have an explanation for any of it. Not the light, not the sounds, not the figure I saw outside the window, and definitely not how someone managed to remove an entire section of steel staircase in the middle of the night without us hearing it. Every time I see Charles, this is something we still talk about. I go camping alone a few times a year. I've been doing it since I was in my 20s, and at this point I'm in my late 30s, so close to 15 years of solo trips at this point. I know the risks, which is why I carry a rifle. This happened about 2 years ago in the Daniel Boone National Forest in eastern Kentucky. It's a massive stretch of forest, over 700,000 acres. And if you know where to go, you can hike for days without seeing another person. I had a rough stretch of work, and my head wasn't in a great place, and I felt like I just needed a few days away from everything. I drove out on a Thursday morning. I parked at a trailhead off a Forest Service road and started hiking. The plan was simple. 3 nights in the backcountry. That was pretty much it. I had my tent, my pack, enough food and water for 4 days, my .308 bolt action that I always bring on solo trips. The first day was exactly what I needed. I covered about 7 miles before finding a flat spot near a creek bed that looked like a good place to camp. I set up my tent, gathered some wood, and had a fire going by the time the sun started going down. I cooked some food, drank a beer, and slept by the fire until it burned down to embers. The whole time, I didn't see a single person. I fell asleep around 10 o'clock. I woke up at some point in the middle of the night. I'm not sure what woke me. It was more like my brain just switched on for no reason, the way it does sometimes when you're sleeping somewhere unfamiliar. I lay there for a minute and stared at the ceiling of my tent. But as my eyes adjusted, I noticed something. There was a faint orangey glow coming through the walls of my tent. I unzipped the tent flap and looked out. Maybe 200 yards away through the trees, there was a fire. Not a big one. It was about the size of a campfire, but it was definitely there. It was flickering, which is how I knew it was a fire. I watched it for a few minutes, waiting to hear talking or something. I wanted to verify it wasn't just some spontaneous forest fire, but after observing it for a while, I couldn't perceive anything beyond the flames themselves. I continued to watch a bit longer to see if it would expand uncontrollably, yet it didn't. I concluded it was likely another camper's setup nearby that I had overlooked during the day. This wasn't inconceivable, especially since I had retired relatively early. I assumed whoever it was had gone to sleep, leaving their fire unattended, which is irresponsible, but not uncommon. After watching it for approximately 5 more minutes, I re-zipped my tent and went to sleep. It didn't trouble me much. When I awoke the next morning, the fire was the first thing that came to mind. Not because it had frightened me, but out of curiosity. I wanted to see who else was out there. perhaps to greet them, but primarily to satisfy my inquisitiveness. I packed up my campsite and trekked towards the area where the fire had been. It took me about 10 minutes to reach the spot. I was quite confident I had the correct location. There was a natural clearing that aligned with the angle from which I had been watching. But upon arrival, I paused. There was no fire pit, no ring of stones, no pile of ash, no scorched ground, no charred wood, nothing at all. The ground was utterly undisturbed. I walked the entire clearing, searching for any indication that someone had been there, but found no signs of life whatsoever. The area was pristine. I stood there for a while, genuinely perplexed. I was certain I had seen a fire. It had been a campfire burning distinctly for at least 5 minutes while I observed it, and yet, the ground where it should have been appeared as if no one had stepped there in months. I considered the possibility that I had the wrong location, but there wasn't another clearing anywhere near the correct distance or direction. There wasn't much more I could do, though, so I simply moved on. I still had 2 more nights planned, and I wasn't about to cut my trip short over something so trivial. I hiked for most of the day. The terrain transformed as I ventured deeper into the forest. The creek bed receded behind me, and the ground began to incline. By mid-afternoon, I was in a denser, older part of the forest, where the trees were taller, and the canopy was thick enough to obscure most of the sky. It was quieter there, which was pleasant. I discovered a suitable campsite around 4 o'clock. That evening passed without incident. I doused my fire a little after 9 and settled in for the night. I don't know what time it was when the sound roused me, but it was loud enough to pull me from a dead sleep. I awoke to a distant, enormous cracking sound, like a thick branch being snapped in half, except it continued. It was violent, lasting for perhaps 3 or 4 seconds. At its conclusion, there was a deep, resonant thud that I could quite literally feel reverberating through the ground beneath me. I instantly recognized it. A tree had fallen somewhere deeper in the woods, or at the very least, a very large branch. If you've ever heard the sound of a tree falling before, which I understand is a somewhat rare occurrence, it's both amazing and terrifying. It didn't scare me per se, but the deafening force and magnitude of it gave me an intense adrenaline rush. I lay there in my sleeping bag, trying to comprehend what had just caused it. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. It wasn't storming, and there was barely any wind. I couldn't think of anything that would have brought a tree down on a night like this. But there was also nothing I could do. I couldn't fall asleep at that point either. My heart was still pounding, and the adrenaline kept me awake. So I just closed my eyes and waited for it to subside. But then, not 10 minutes later, it happened again. Only this time, it was much louder. That same gruesome crackling sound, followed by a crash of branches and a deafening thud. But this one was close, not directly on top of me, but close enough that the sound was almost disorienting, and it emanated from a completely different direction than the first one. The first tree had fallen somewhere to the south, and the second one was to my northwest. I sat up immediately. Now I was genuinely scared. 2 trees falling on the same night in 2 different parts of the forest, with no wind and no storm. That was inconceivable. I kept trying to devise an explanation that made sense. The most logical thought was that the first one had caused some kind of chain reaction. But that hypothesis didn't account for the fact that the trees fell in entirely different sections of the forest. Whatever brought down the first tree had no connection to the second one. They were 2 distinct events. But that was even more inconceivable. I was sitting there processing all of this when I heard something new, something that escalated my fear from a moderate 5 to a resounding 10. It was this low and continuous rumbling sound that I can only describe as a cross between a groan and a growl, like a person clearing their throat, except it didn't stop. It wasn't an animal sound I recognized. I've heard bears, I've heard elk, I've heard bobcats, This wasn't any of those. It sounded like something was intentionally making the noise. And it continued for what felt like a full minute, without any break or variation. I did the only thing I could think to do. I grabbed my rifle, chambered around as quietly as I could, and aimed it at the tent flap. At that point, I was in full panic. I must have sat like that for 20 minutes. The sound eventually tapered off. It didn't cease abruptly. It kind of faded out, as if whatever was making it had moved further away. And just like that, the forest was quiet again. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I don't think I would have been able to if I had tried. It was the worst night of my life. Snorts. As soon as I saw daylight, I exited the tent. I packed up as quickly as possible, still spooked and extremely unsettled despite being able to see. Once everything was in my pack, I started walking in the direction of the second tree, the louder and closer one. I needed to see it, if only to confirm that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. I held my rifle at the ready. After about 10 minutes, I found the tree. It was massive, its trunk lying at an angle across a shallow slope. Broken branches and debris were scattered all around it. So, it was real. I genuinely couldn't believe it. I had been trying to convince myself I had merely imagined everything from the night before. But there it was. I needed to continue investigating. I wouldn't have been satisfied leaving without knowing what had caused the fall. I walked over to the stump, which was about 3 feet high. The wood where it had broken was pale and fresh, but the break wasn't clean. It wasn't the kind of jagged, splintered fracture you get from wind stress or root failure. The wood around the break point had been torn apart in a way I had never seen before. Parts of the stump looked as though they had been gouged. I truly don't know how else to describe it. There were long, irregular grooves running through the wood at different angles, and it looked like some of them were at least an inch deep. The wood genuinely appeared to have been stripped and chewed rather than cut or snapped. The more I looked, the more I noticed. Some of the bark around the base had been peeled away in long strips, and the exposed wood underneath had that same gouged, chewed-up appearance. I cannot pretend I understood what I was looking at, because I didn't. I'd seen beaver damage before, and this was not that. Beavers leave clean cuts. I'd seen woodpecker damage, and this wasn't that either. This was aggressive, messy, and covered far too much surface area to be any animal I could conceive of. The tree hadn't fallen because it was dead, or because the wind knocked it over. Something had worked on that trunk until it came down, and suddenly I felt this truly nasty feeling in my gut. I needed to leave. I stopped examining the tree and started backing away. But as I was turning to depart, something near one of the tree branches caught my eye. There was a small cluster of items sitting on the ground. If it weren't for the fact that they looked man-made, I wouldn't have even bothered checking them out. As soon as I saw what they were, I lost all composure. It was a blue bandana and a carabiner, and they were both my items. I instantly started rummaging through my pack and confirmed those 2 items were missing. In that moment, I grabbed my gear, shoved it into my backpack, and ran. I didn't know if running was the right decision, if that would attract attention to me, but I did it anyway. I just needed to get out of those woods. I grew tired after a while under the weight of all my stuff, but I moved as fast as I could. The hike back took me most of the day, and the entire time I felt as though I was being stalked or watched. I felt like something was going to jump out from somewhere any second. I kept my rifle in my hands the entire time. I made it back to my car around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I drove out of there so fast, despite my exhaustion. The first thing I did when I reached a safe distance away was call the police. I don't think they took me very seriously, but I didn't care. I also knew there probably wasn't much they could do, but I didn't care about that either. I was pretty traumatized for days afterward. None of it made any sense whatsoever. What I couldn't get over was the fact that my belongings had been rummaged through. Something had either stalked me through the woods or knew where I was the entire time. That unexplainable fire from the first night must have had something to do with it. There's no way that was a coincidence. And those trees, I still have no explanation for what could have cut them down. I genuinely don't think it was anything human, but as for what animal it could have been, I have no idea. Unbelievable as it may seem, I continue to go camping, yet I suspect this particular memory will haunt me indefinitely.